Woke event. This event was purely student-led and purely student biased. This wasn't an event by organization nor by, I guess, from a professor or from the staff. It was really collectively put together. We got two amazing speakers for you tonight, and we're about to get started.
Who taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate, you should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God gave you?
That's the ultimate question. Who taught us? How do we learn these different things? Where did these things stem from? What are the problems that come from those things? Internalized racism, light versus dark, colorism, however you want to call it. Escape from your community. Oh, you have nice hair, you have bad hair, you have decent hair. What is black on black crime? Why is black on black crime so high? Who taught us this stuff? And this is where we're blessed to have Dr. Brandy Wells come speak to us. She has some amazing classes, so she really inspire y'all. And I hope y'all give her a great round of applause as she comes up here.
Good evening.
How's everyone?
Good.
Pretty good. I am very happy to be here today, and I am grateful and privileged for the invitation. I've met a number of you. Some of you have taken my course. Others, this is my first time meeting you, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a native Georgian. I grew up in the small town of Bainbridge, Georgia, which is southwest of Albany. I spent my undergraduate years here in Augusta as a student at Payne College. And during those years, I came to the campus of then Augusta State University on several occasions, mostly for events related to my sorority. After graduating from Payne, I attended graduate school at The Ohio State University, where I earned my master's and PhD in history. So I moved from a historically black college that at that time had about 1,000 students, right, and mostly students of color, to The Ohio State University, which had about 30,000 students, or more than 30,000 students, and the majority of those students, or those faces, were white faces. So I found myself answering questions that we are tackling here today. So in addition to thinking about who taught us hate, some of the questions that I asked myself at that time and that I hope that we'll think about tonight is, how do we self-love? How do we self-care for ourselves, but also for others in our community? What healing needs to take place, and what does that healing look like? And then what miseducation, in the words of Carter G. Woodson, and then the great Lauren Hill posed this question again, needs to be unearthed, uprooted, and starved out so that that poison of hate can't continue to wreak havoc in our lives, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and so on. And given the title of today's event, we can think about the film Get Out, which has taught us to think about the sunken place as a concept and what that means, and if we are indeed in the sunken place and how we get out of that. So how do we rid ourselves of internalized racism? How do we get out of buying into white supremacist views of black bodies needing to be judged, to be controlled, and to be policed? As a historian, of course, I believe that answering such questions begin with history. And it begins with being a scholar of history and just a scholar in general. So here at Augusta University, I teach courses in U.S. history, African American history, women history. So especially in my African American history course, I begin with the study of the African continent. And so Chaz and Raquel and a number of students will be able to tell you that that's where we start. And at the start of the course, there are a few students who know a little bit about Ghana, but very few students, or hardly any students, know about Mali and Songhai and Ethiopia and Axum and Kush, right? And so we're able to talk about African civilizations. So when I talk about the history of African Americans, I don't begin it as a history of oppression. I don't begin it as a history of enslavement. And I think that's very important for students of color, but also white students who take my course, right? So this longer history and narrative of black history. In my U.S. history classes, when we talk about slavery, we talk about the rich ancestral homelands and rich indigenous cultures of enslaved persons, right? So these individuals are able to emerge as living, active agents, right? And so what this looks like. And so I do this both consciously and methodically, because I believe that it's important for students of all backgrounds to move past a tenet of that day, and perhaps we can say of today, of seeing black oppression as normal and natural, right? So I try to get students to think about that. And then we think about the rich history, diversity, beauty, and wealth of the African continent. So I hope in today's discussion we'll be able to think about where does this begin, these questions, right? Because the teaching of self-hate doesn't just involve African Americans, but it's a concept of blackness generally. And so in thinking about that, students in my course, we talk about blackness as a construct, but whiteness is also a construct, right? We think about Africa as a construct, Europe as a construct, and what does that mean? It means that those concepts are rooted in time and in space. And what happens is there are characteristics that are assigned to particular groups and are assigned to particular geographies. And so we can think about what that means, right? Because when you think about black, what has the nation sort of taught you that black is? What does black look like?
Thuggish.
Oh, very good. So thuggish?
Dead.
Ooh, dead. Okay, so death. What else?
Loud.
Oh, that's good. Black is ugly. What else?
Evil.
Black is evil. Someone said ignorant. Did I hear ignorant? Over here, ignorant. So have you noticed that all of those terms are negative? Right? What about lazy, insolent, right? Undeserving. The opposite then, white, right? Inherently bad, inherently negative. And again, that's not just African Americans that have to deal with that. That emanates from a discussion about the continent itself. And so when we think about fake news, right, and this popular and highly overutilized term today, we can think about the fact that Africa has long been the victim of fake news, right? And so we think about that identity. And so I ask students to think about, to ask and to answer questions such as, did Africans, again, that's a term of invention, did they produce a civilization that rivaled ancient Greece? Absolutely, they did. Right, and so the Greeks and a number of European societies borrowed from African societies. And was Africa always, quote, poor and underdeveloped?
No.
Right? So what does that look like? And then do African Americans as a diasporic, but also as a nationalized people, have a history that they can be proud of? So if we take it back to Africa and we think about all of this, is there a history that African Americans can be proud of? What do you think? Some of you say yes? Everyone agree? It's a proud history? Right? Is that the history that's taught in schools, or did you learn that history somewhere else?
Somewhere else.
I took your class.
Okay, very good. So you took my class. Some of you learned it at home in your communities, right? So we can think about the way in which Africa, the way in which African Americans are taught or not taught in U.S. history courses. And so what it is the concept of African American comes out of shared oppression, because many of these enslaved persons came from a variety of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. And so what makes them African American is this oppression and the struggle against oppression. And so when we think about African American history, what I want you to know and what you have expressed is that African Americans have a history that is admirable, right? They should be admired for their tenacity, for their state building. This is even under the institution of slavery, for their resolve. And so what this means is, for those of you who write on your Facebook page, or you wear shirts that say, "I am not my ancestors, you can catch these hands," you're in a sunken place. You don't know your history. You don't know the history of the nation. You don't know the history of Africa. You don't know the history of African Americans, right? So I want you to continue to think about that and the way in which you're reinforcing a myth. And you should take my classes, because I teach against that. Even more, I would be remiss if, when I give you that example, I don't tell you that the physical confrontation of one lone racist or Nazi is not enough to undo the foundational and insidious nature of white supremacy. I can recall more than once in graduate school where I was verbally attacked or ridiculed by my peers. There was a time that white male students in my cohort complained purposely so that I could hear them. So we're in a room with about 30 students. I am the only student of color. And they were complaining that African American students in the program had taken over.
Wow.
That they had taken the spots of some more deserving and some more academically prepared white male students. To put this in context, out of a class of 30 incoming students in my cohort, there were 2 black students, myself and one other person. But somehow this was an invasion, right? And so I have to sit there as a black woman and think about what this is like. And I know that they were looking for a reaction of sorts, okay? That's just one occasion. There's another time when a white male graduate student complained in a course that he didn't like to read the essays of black students. And this is black students at Ohio State University who, like all other undergraduates, likely graduated in the top 10% of their class. And perhaps even higher, being that you all know the adage that you have to be 10 times as good, right, to get the same thing, right? So he's saying they speak in Ebonics and I can't read it and it gives me a headache. And I'm in a class of about 25. Again, I'm the only black person. And everybody turns to look at me to see what I'm going to say, how I'm going to react, right? And so a physical lashing out, what do you think that would have done? Like a physical lashing out or cursing them out?
Reinforce the stereotype.
Yeah, so it
Reinforce
reinforces this
stereotype.
stereotype, right? That I didn't deserve what? To be there in the first place?
Yeah.
What else?
It would say you're ghetto,
Uh-huh.
black woman.
There we go. I'm the angry black woman. So all of those stereotypes that go along with that. And so thinking about my behavior. So what I tried to do is self-love. So I reached out to my community. That didn't mean that I didn't pop off sometimes. So I don't want you to think that I didn't say, something sometimes. I did. But I had to be calculated. That means we have to be thoughtful. We can't respond to everything. And there are certain ways of responding. And so in a lot of these instances, what I would do is go back to my community, to my confidants, to my friends, and I tried to self-care. And sometimes I talked. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes it's just about being with another person of color, and they understand what this experience is. And so, again, I just want to commend you all for this great event that you're putting on, the issues that you're trying to discuss and potentially overcome, especially here on this campus. But when we think about African Americans becoming a new people, as we talked about under this system of oppression, that means that they experience untold and still understudied levels of physical and psychological trauma. And those scars are still with us, okay? And as Daniel told us, we can see them in the issues of colorism. But to that, I would add body type and dress. I would add hair texture, we talked about. What about language choice?
Yes.
How people talk, right?
Yep.
And so sometimes we police each other's language. We don't like the way it was said, the language that was used. What about neighborhood and zone?
Absolutely.
Where you come from, where you were born, where you live, where you went to school.
Mm-hmm.
So
Hospital
class
born in.
issues. All of those are still contentious issues that we'll get into tonight. So as African Americans have sought to survive systemic racism and to gain practice, real practice of their innate, but also their nationally bounded civil rights, what we see is that a number have consciously and unconsciously participated in racial bias. And so recognizing and contending with internalized racism, namely that blackness is ugly, as Brickell said, that is violent, as someone else said, that is criminalistic, that it needs to be corrected. And by corrected, that means whitened in a way. Is the only way that we can undo that psychological terror and damage. And so the film Get Out extends these points by introducing into one conversation complicity, brainwashing, sociological deception, along with white privilege and pretense. So I look forward to our discussions tonight as we interrogate what that means, right? How that exists and what it looks like in maybe our individual lives, and how we get out of that sunken place. So in your minds, or maybe what you've read, what is that sunken place?
Well, you actually believe that your own people are inferior.
Okay. Is it conscious and unconscious, or?
It's both.
Okay. So you believe that that your own people, and generally we're talking about people of color or black people,
Yes.
are inferior. Anybody else want to add anything to be in that sunken place?
You allow people who cannot relate to you to value you.
No.
Very good. People who cannot relate to you to value you, to assign you value, right? Anything else? When you think of that concept of sunken place?
When I think of sunken place, I think of like when we try to get out the sunken place, we go against, like, they say stereotypes black people, they say black people like chicken Kool-Aid. Just because you say black people like it doesn't mean I have to go against that grain. So it's still another way of a sunken place because now I'm running against my identity
Okay.
at the same time.
Okay. Any others want to add to that? Over here.
You're letting people come define who you are.
Okay.
You're telling you what's right, how you're supposed to act, and how you're supposed to be.
Okay.
Instead of guiding you.
Absolutely. So it's outside versus inside. It's not a self-definition.
I think it's when you don't know your own identity. You don't know. So you have no direction at all.
Oh, absolutely. So knowing that history again is so very important. And so I wanted to keep my remarks brief. I'll just close by offering you a few coping and survival techniques that I have used. And hopefully, again, we'll get into some of those today, and you'll continue to talk about this here and with your friends. And one I've mentioned already, and that's that you can't get out of that sunken place and that you cannot survive without having community. It's just impossible to do so. Community will enable you to be yourself, to take off the mask, as Paul Lawrence Dunbar said, to share and to heal those scars that are inflicted both through micro and macro aggressions. And if you didn't know, I have a little news for you. Those aren't going away, those aggressions, right? So just because I finished graduate school and got a job as a professor, do you think that means that I don't still hear remarks?
No.
But I'm still not I don't still have to deal with micro and macro aggressions. This is lifelong, which means that self-care is lifelong, right? And so your community might change, but you always need to have community. Another is to be thoughtful. We must all be cognizant. To Chaz's point, we must be thoughtful. We must be engaged. And when I want you to think about thoughtfulness, and we think about consciousness and unconsciousness, and being in that sunken place, I want you to think about the experiences of other students of color, but then also think about the experiences of professors of color and respect your professors of color. Okay, so oftentimes I have students of color who don't recognize my credentials and how hard I work. They'll call me Miss Wells, and they'll turn around and call a white male colleague Dr. Adams. What you're doing is you're buying into a myth that knowledge is white-based, that the conduits of knowledge should be white men or whites, right? So you want to be thoughtful, always be thoughtful about these things, about how you engage with other individuals. You want to find a mentor and a sponsor. And a mentor can be a person of color, because many of us have walked in those same paths that you're walking now. So we can share with you some insight. Sometimes we might just cry with you. Sometimes we might just sit with you. I've had students before, students of color, who have come into my office and said, I don't want to talk, I just want to sit here. And we'll do that with you, okay? So be mindful of the fact also that there are very few professors of color on campus. How many of you have had more than one black professor? Very good. 2 on this campus. 3. 4. What might that tell you? What do you think my point of asking that question is? Does that bother you that you don't have black professors? Right? So one thing you must be sure to do is take those classes that are offered, right? Those classes that are offered with you in mind. So Dr. Saretha Williams is here. She teaches a number of African American literature courses. You should be in those classes. I have a class next semester on black women in U.S. history. Dr. Massey in EFL is teaching African American Lit next semester? Yeah. Okay. Do you think those classes are brimming with enrollment? Some are in danger of being canceled. So right now we're sitting there, we're having a conversation about self-love and self-care, but that also means enrolling in those courses when they are available, because that's how you signal to white administrators that this matters. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So you want to pay
absolutely.
attention in that way. And then sponsors. So sponsors are typically those who are white males, because we know that we live in a world and we live in a society where whiteness constitutes privilege. So in addition to having mentors of color, you need to have sponsors who are white. Okay? And the reason that is because they can vouch for you. They can vouch for your entrance into avenues and opportunities that otherwise are closed off. And that's just the truth, okay? So you want to be with them. You want to learn from your interactions with them. You want to learn the language. You want to learn the tricks. But you never, ever want to drink the Kool-Aid. You never ever want to drink the Kool-Aid. So those are some of the
Good-
tips and
good quote.
strategies that I'll offer to you. And so I look forward to whatever questions you might have for me in the question and answer. Thank you all.
I think that was interesting, like she was saying. We have so many classes here. I know I talked to a lot of y'all individually. I talked to a lot of y'all individually, and I ask y'all all the time. Have y'all heard of Brandy Wells' class? Most people I talk to say no. Who is Brandy Wells? Is that Brandy Sweat? I got married. Nah. And I know a lot of times it was crazy because one of my best friends, Chaz, he took that class. And I was like, man, this sounds amazing. Never heard of it. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, you know, that's messed up. I'm hearing about it now, and I can't take it. Because I'm a senior. I graduated. Can't take it. So it's like, you know, and a lot of times I know you talk to the freshmen, they have no idea of the stuff that's around us. And I'm going to tell this story real quick. I was telling you earlier today. I was handing out flyers all week. I handed out this girl. She was probably a freshman, sophomore. Handed her a flower. She laughed. She laughed in my face. Now I could tell she was laughing because she was uncomfortable with the flower. She thought, when she seen the flower, I guess she thought it was embarrassing. You're just going to complain and be mad and, you know, I guess she could feel that hurt inside of her. I could see it. I could see it. I remember being in the same place. And it was funny, and I wanted to ask her, why you laughing? I just smiled and went on. But that really made me think that night was, I'm doing this for a reason. Because I was that student. If you would have handed me that flower, I would have did the same as that thing. And so a lot of times, and that's what this meeting for is tonight. It's for us to expose, to talk, and also to grow and to teach these things upon more so the youth, even the freshmen, even the sophomores. Cause I look at it all the time. There's so much stuff I missed out on. From freshman and sophomore year, just run around doing the most simplistic stuff. Whereas now, junior, senior, you want to do something to change, but slick, it's a little too late. You're a little too old. I think that's the way life works a lot of times. Think about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was started at 10 instead of 30, you know what I'm saying? Or different things, you know, systematically changed. And so now we're about to have Dr. Roscoe Williams come speak. But first, I'm going to let Miss Brandy Wells, y'all don't realize, I think she had family coming in today. She didn't have to come. She really didn't have to come. That was real big for me. She came. And I'm going to ask her to come back up and take your questions.
Okay, all right.
If
If
y'all
there are
have any
questions.
questions. If there's any questions y'all would like, okay.
One question for me was, how do you think that we could bridge the communication between the black students on campus and then the professors and the doctors here that represent us? Because I know some people that used to go here, maybe in 2009, 2010, they said that they were connected with the African American students on campus. They knew who the professors were. The professors made sure they were in class, made sure they were good on campus, and gave them other avenues throughout campus to network. So how do you believe that we can have a better communication of knowing where y'all are present and what classes y'all offer, as well as how can we make that knowledge available to the freshmen and the sophomores who can take these courses as electives and still have the space within the curriculum to get on top of these?
That's a good question, because I think something that has come out already is it seems like students who learn about the courses that we offer, it seems to be through word of mouth. A student who's taken the class before who said you should take that class. Look for and encourage others. So one component you've already sort of answered, right? So if you become aware of a professor of color in the classes that they're teaching, you know, share those courses on your social media, talk to others about it. If you're in organizations here on campus, make sure to share that information with the students in that organization. Did you know Dr. Williams is teaching this class? How many of us can take that class? Did you know that Dr. Wells, or in sociology, there's Dr. Candace, is it psychology? Psychology. Dr. Candace Best. And so be aware of those classes and just do what you've been doing of passing on that information I don't know if there's some kind of listserv that exists.
I'll just say that those students that you're talking about.
Keep waking up all hours of the night. Don't know what's causing it, how or why. Maybe it's the things that run through my mind. Spark up this kush, get high as a kite. I'm just smoking it to reach a new height. Why check my Twitter and grab a quick bite. Lay on the bed till I see the sun. Lay on the bed till I see the sun.